the suspended BBC presenter has been named in a statement issued by his wife as Huw Edwards. What's your reaction to this?
Well, first of all, I'm very surprised at all that has happened. And secondly, I'd like to say these are very serious allegations that really should be investigated properly, mostly for the alleged victims, but also for everybody involved, all those affected by it. So I'm afraid I'm not going to say very much more about it because the police have been asked to assess the situation correctly and they'll be making a decision as to what further actions to take.
So my understanding is the police have said that they won't be pressing charges, that there is no evidence of criminality. In that case, is it time to draw a line under it, in your view?
Well, look, there are various different issues to look at, I'm sure, here, and the BBC will have to make a decision about that. I'm afraid I don't know the details of the case. I know that Lucy Fraser, the Culture Secretary, is keeping very closely informed and speaking to Tim Davie, the head of the BBC, about these issues, and they'll have to make a decision as to what's going on. But I do understand that these are serious allegations that apply in various different ways, and so I think the BBC will have a responsibility to report back when they've made their inquiries.
There's been lots of speculation while the peasant's name was kept a secret. Jeremy Vine, for example, among just one of persons speaking out to say that he thought that the individual should be named. Do you think that's the right thing now that this name's in the public domain?
Well, I think one of the things we've always got to be careful of is trial-based social media. And that's not just because, of course, people are innocent until they're proven guilty, but it's also because in some circumstances, if the allegations were to lead to a criminal trial, you don't want that trial to be prejudiced by things that people may have said in public or the way in which a jury may have been influenced. And so it is important that we respect the rule of law, that we respect the principles that we've set out over many hundreds of years to protect every citizen so that we can get fair trials and those who are guilty can be properly tried and properly sentenced.
Do you think the social media companies are doing enough? I mean, when Sky News, for example, approached them for comment, asked for an interview, we were sent a poo emoji.
I think that is a remarkable thing to have sent and certainly not appropriate. I mean, look, there are some social media companies that have behaved extremely well over many years and others, frankly, have questions to answer. So I hope very much that those who are struggling with understanding their social responsibilities will be thinking hard about how they respond.
I just want to talk a little bit about the statement that's been issued. It's literally just come out just before I've been speaking to you, so I understand you may not have had much time to digest it. But the wife of Huw Edwards says that he is now receiving inpatient hospital care for serious mental health issues. He'll stay there for the foreseeable future. I guess, do you feel sorry for him?
The number of people who are affected by serious mental health issues in this country is much greater than I think many realise, and it's something that I'm very pleased that the government and, in fact, the Prince of Wales have been championing over recent years, and I think it's important that we take it seriously, but I also think it's important that victims have access to justice at different kinds now. I understand the police have said they don't see a reason to continue with these investigations, but we've got to keep a balance there, and in this circumstance I think we've got to give the family a bit of space, and I think the right thing to do is to allow the BBC to conduct whatever investigation they feel they need to do and to make sure that the family are not dragged into this. After all, you know, there's one person who's been alleged to have done wrong, not his whole family.
Do you think the BBC have got questions to answer about how they've handled it?
I think when this is over, a lot of people will be looking over what happened and when decisions were taken and how they were taken. The trouble with these questions, and I appreciate why you're asking them, but the difficulty I have in answering them is I have very partial information, and I don't want to rush to judgment when actually these are serious allegations, and the correct thing to do is to find out what actually happened before casting aspersions on anyone.
Do you think, and I'm sure I can probably predict the answer to this, but do you think we'll be seeing Huw Edwards on the news at 10 again? Or should we?
I mean, that's very difficult for me to answer. I mean, I can't second-guess this at all, but these are very, very important questions for the BBC to answer. Now it's got to conduct its own internal investigation. I'm sure they will, I'm sure they'll keep the Culture Secretary informed, and I'm sure at the end of it they'll let us know what the investigation found. But these, we've got to give space for those investigations to happen for fairness, not just for Mr. Edwards, but for those individuals who are brought into it as well.
OK. Well, thank you for talking about the story. It's a difficult story for, to talk about when you, as you say, we've only just got the name just now before you came into the studio, so we do appreciate that. I'm keen to talk to you a little bit about NATO as well, and the big summit that happened today. It feels like it was thrown off course, shall we say, by some statements that we got from the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, saying that Ukrainians need to show gratitude towards countries providing them with weapons. We're not Amazon.
Well, I think one of the things that we've got to look at is the way in which the United Kingdom has supported Ukraine so incredibly strongly, not actually just for the last 18 months, but really since 2014-15, when we started training the Ukrainian armed forces and became very active in supporting Ukraine and making sure, in fact, that they were prepared for what then happened. Not that we could have predicted it, but what then happened. And, what the Prime Minister has done, what Rishi has done over the last few months is really extremely important. He's been absolutely front and centre of not only making sure the Ukrainians have the weapons they need, but also, as you would have heard, in making it quite clear that NATO, that Ukraine's place is in NATO. And I think those statements are extremely important to making sure...
I wasn't asking you about what Rishi Sunak has done for Ukraine. I'm asking you about what Ben Wallace has said today, that implying that Ukrainians aren't being grateful enough for...
I think, to be fair, when you read the whole of the Times story, and I know you have, he's making the point that when negotiating with American legislators, some of whom don't view the Ukraine conflict in the same way that we do, which is that the Ukrainians are quite literally on the front line of freedom.
I don't buy that, I'll be honest, because look, I'll just read you a direct quote. I said to the Ukrainians last year, Ben Wallace, when I drove 11 hours to them to be given a list, I said, I am not Amazon. Sounds like he's talking about his own view as well. Well,
he may be, but the paragraph before that speaks about negotiating with American lawmakers.
He admits that he told the Ukrainians directly, I am not Amazon.
Well, I think it's important that we make sure that we are alongside Ukraine on issues.
He also said in that bit that he drove 11 hours to Kyiv. I mean, it sounds a little bit like, he's saying, why should I be giving up my time? I had to drive 11 hours. Come on, in the context of the Ukraine war, having to drive 11 hours isn't exactly really putting yourself out that much, is it?
I don't think that's quite fair on Ben. Ben was the minister responsible when we got the NLAWs into Kiev in February. And if you'll remember at the time, there was a lot of people, in other countries especially, but there was a lot of people who were saying we shouldn't be sending weapons at that moment because Kiev was going to fall anyway and the Russians were going to roll over the border and it was all over. And Ben was absolutely instrumental at making sure that they had the weapons that were essential for those first few days, that was the NLAWs, and then maintained that support throughout. So Ben's in a different position to many in Ukraine. Ben can be pretty frank with the Ukrainians because he's been there since the beginning. He's been absolutely side by side with the Ukrainian armed forces, making sure they had the capability. So I think, when looking at these comments, you've got to look at them in context. Ben has been absolutely key to this operation from the UK perspective, of course, but also from the Ukrainian perspective. And the UK is in a very particular place. It's one of the things that's very encouraging. When I was in Ukraine in August, and indeed a few months before that, one of the things that really struck me was how pro-British, how very grateful Ukrainians are and have been to the UK. It's been something that's really touched me, but, I'm also very grateful to the Ukrainians. They are genuinely defending European freedom in the struggle that they're conducting at the moment against Russian aggression.
Is there a worry, then, that people are getting Ukraine fatigue?
No, I don't think there is. I mean, look, I travel around the United Kingdom a lot, and one of the...
But elsewhere as well, in the US, for example, we can see what's playing out with the upcoming presidential election. Is there a worry that actually some politicians, some members of the public indeed, might be looking at the amount of money, at the amount of weapons going there and thinking, how long is this going to go on for?
Sophie, I think it's reasonable for politicians, representatives of their communities, to ask how much money is being spent and is it being spent appropriately. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing for people to ask. What's quite striking is all the way across the United Kingdom, you see Ukrainian flags everywhere. I mean, you see them on public buildings, you see them on private buildings, you see them in shops, you see them on supermarkets, you see them all over the place. You know, the level of support for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people here is enormous. And when you look at when we open the doors to Ukrainians to come and seek shelter in the UK, the number of people, I mean, I'm always deeply touched by the generosity of the British public. And how many people opened their homes, quite literally opened their homes, to Ukrainians who needed somewhere to shelter as this war against them was being conducted by this evil Russian regime.
A couple of other questions while I've got you. You've been looking at the threats to the UK, in particular on the sort of cyber security side. How concerned are you about China in particular in this space? Well,
look, we've seen, I'm afraid to say, hostile activity by states against the UK growing in recent years. We've seen it getting worse, and we've seen cyber attacks, as you mentioned. We've seen from Iran, we've seen attempted assassinations, as Ken McCullum, the head of MI5, reported only a few months ago. We've seen disinformation. We've seen a whole series of different ways in which hostile states are trying to do harm to the United Kingdom and harm the British people and our freedoms. And that's why, you know, this government has reacted so clearly, because the first duty of any government is to protect the British people, and that's exactly what we've done. So we've introduced, as you know, the National Security Act, which is a fantastically important piece of legislation. Fundamentally, it does two things. The first is it makes sure that we're a harder target. It deters aggression and it disrupts aggressors in their actions. And the second thing it does is it gives powers to our intelligence services to pursue those who either are trying to do harm to us or are siding with those who try to do harm with us. And I think that's incredibly important and a very important response to some of the aggressions that we've heard about.
And then just finally, I want to ask you about pay in the sort of public sector, because of course we're getting the recommendations through from the pay bodies. It's a time of high inflation. The government is wary about giving too many pay rises out. But I just want to talk to you about the armed forces in particular. There have been reports that the pay review bodies have recommended pay increases 6 to 6.5%. Do you think that's about right? Do you think they deserve a pay rise at that level?
Look, I'm not going to conduct a negotiation that Ben's actually conducting at this moment, because I'm not in the details of it. But I think what's really important to recognise is that when pay review bodies make recommendations, we take them extremely seriously. But we've got to also take something else very seriously, and that's inflation. You know, we all know that inflation is a thief in the night. It steals off literally everybody. It erodes your savings, it erodes your earnings. It's an incredibly damaging economic problem, and that's why getting inflation down is so incredibly important, and using every lever that we can to make sure that we're controlling inflation in this country and bringing it down.
Even if it's the people who are defending our country, putting their lives on the line, not on massive salaries.
Well, I was a soldier, as you know, for 13 years, and I think it's an incredibly important job to do, and I'm incredibly grateful for those who are doing it today. And I think we should recognise the service that people give in the armed forces.
Should they be prioritised, do you think, when it comes to pay rises?
Well, I'm very glad to say that the armed forces regularly are prioritised, and this government has prioritised the armed forces in many different... Well, this government has prioritised the armed forces in many different ways. I don't know if you remember when Rishi was Chancellor, he gave a huge boost to the defence budget, negotiated by Ben, but, you know, delivered by Rishi. And Rishi has been absolutely front and centre in making sure that armed forces are properly equipped and ready to serve.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.